Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Manara Podcast. Joined with me here today are Khabaib and Zayn, members of the project, and we're going to be having an interesting discussion today on liberalism, its components, and nihilism, and how liberalism leads to nihilism. I think it's fair to say, it's a very relevant topic in today's world. Certainly, a lot of material there to dig into. And I can't think of any two people better for that discussion than yourselves, Zayn and Khabaib. So, yeah, without further ado, we'll kick it off. So I think best area to start that discussion off is with just an introduction on liberalism and what it is.
Sure, I can just jump in there and start. Assalamu alaikum both. Thanks for organising Abeer. And yeah, I think it's important to recognise that liberalism is one of the many constituent ideologies of the Enlightenment. And we'll notice in this podcast and during any discussion of liberalism or the Enlightenment how it's intimately related and how the features of liberalism are oftentimes very much just the features of the Enlightenment. Liberalism was obviously an ideology that grew out of the context and environment of Europe across the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th, and 20th centuries. Up until now, it's still an evolving ideology. And some of the main thinkers include Rousseau, who's famous for his idea of the social contract, John Stuart Mill, who's famous for his thoughts on liberty and utilitarianism and suffrage for women. His teacher was Jeremy Bentham, himself a famous utilitarian thinker. And it's always important to mention people like Kant, who is again the biggest Enlightenment thinker and had a very big effect on liberalism, and John Locke, whose famous phrase about life, liberty, and property are almost a cliche in terms of how famous they are in terms of describing liberalism. So it's important to have these thinkers and their ideas. They really sort of contextualize liberalism and its development. But yeah, that's just sort of my opening salvo. I don't know if what you think yourself, Khabaib.
I think we've discussed this many times in the past, and we're very much in agreement that liberalism is, of course, one of those ideologies that emerged from the Enlightenment tradition, alongside other ideas such as socialism and even elements of fascism. We can say these are all kind of liberal, not liberal. Sorry, these are all Enlightenment ideologies. As odd as that might sound, and perhaps it would be good to maybe list some of the similarities that these Enlightenment ideologies in particular tend to have. And for me, at least, the first one that comes to mind is the idea of progress, which we've discussed many times before. We find this in liberal thinking, we find it in socialist and Marxist and other schools of thought, and we of course see it very clearly in fascist and other kind of Enlightenment ideologies.
Most certainly, there's a couple of fundamental features that we'll notice across Enlightenment ideologies, liberalism and communism, feminism, fascism. Although fascism, I think, has elements of the Enlightenment, but it's also counter-Enlightenment in some senses. But yes, I think we'll talk about that more fully later once we frame liberalism. I think it's important just now to focus on the fundamentals of liberalism. I think we agree. I think we'll most likely agree that there are four sort of paradigmatic features of liberalism, or at least these are the four features according to one of our favorite authors, John Gray. And John Gray identifies universalism, individualism, egalitarianism, and meliorism, which is just another word for progress. He identifies these as the four paradigmatic features of liberalism. And I think let's go through them one by one. We can break them down, understand them, critique them, and then frame them into that Enlightenment project. And then, hopefully at the end we'll move towards understanding how that leads to nihilism, which is quite ironic that we want to move there, because I think we're all going to realize is that the fundamental feature of Enlightenment and liberal philosophy is movement. But anyway, so which would you like to start off with, Khabaib? Individualism or egalitarianism?
No, I'll quickly get egalitarianism out of the way, because I think it's quite an easy one to just quickly mention before we go into maybe the meatier ones. So I think the idea of egalitarianism is self-explanatory. Is the idea that a human being is essentially equal, and must be made to be equal in every sense. So of course the idea of equality exists in Islam, but it is like an essential human equality, whereas the equality that we see in liberalism is one that is prescriptive. It wants everybody to be equal, whether socially, in terms of wealth, in terms of in terms of class, geography. Like, despite all of these elements, it demands that everybody be absolutely equal, and it brings other elements into the lens in order to continue its fight against perceived inequalities. And we see this like in much of the social kind of warrior discourse, both in Europe and in the United States, whether it is the narrative of minority rights, first ethnically, religiously, and then they moved into elements of gender, and now elements of sexuality and so on. And of course, this is quite different from what went before, and very different, certainly from the Islamic tradition, in the sense that hierarchy has always existed, and there isn't an anti-hierarchical philosophy in Islam as such. We might have had some very strong discourse on the essential equality of man, and that the only way in which human beings are better than one another are in taqwa, piety. But that doesn't translate into a desire to destroy all kingship, and to destroy property, and to destroy wealth, and so on, and to render everybody absolutely equal in all. And it doesn't translate into this kind of into an anti patriarchal discourse, to use that language. Quite the opposite. So that's egalitarianism.
Yeah, no, I think that's you've given a good introduction to the idea, and you've touched on some of the important aspects of it. How egalitarianism is about removing hierarchy across genders and social classes, and even morality. How John Gray describes egalitarianism in his book Enlightenment's Wake. He describes it as the denial of any natural moral or political hierarchy among human beings, which is just crazy, because hierarchy, like, oftentimes it results in abuses. Oftentimes the idea of dictatorships and unequal, inequitable political hierarchies and social hierarchies can be quite problematic. At the end of the day, leadership and social classes have existed across history, and most definitely across Islamic history. We had military classes and scholarly classes, and there's no need to blend this down and turn us all into the same thing in such a way, and again, even just the moral hierarchy. Obviously, people are differentiated according to their obedience to Allah. That's one of the reasons why we really value each other as Muslims, because we recognize that we worship we all worship Allah, and that has value, that relationship, and again, even human. In terms of the Islamic cosmology, you might say, there's a hierarchy. Allah as the top of existence, and we're all below Him, and this is a fact we've known since the time of Adam alayhi salam. Where humanity was given a certain place in the hierarchy, and obviously that was problematic for some people. But
And of course,
Yeah, just to touch on that as well. Yeah, I feel like you do see that, just as we see in terms of kind of, the tag and certain taglines, especially in the West, like "Eat the Rich" is a very common one, and things like that. And I've even
defund the police. Yeah,
defund the police. A lot of these taglines, which represent that desire to destroy these kind of hierarchies and these structures that are in place, which, yeah, certainly there's room for discussion on how they're problematic and how that there's issues. There are problems there. There's no doubt about that. We're all aware that there's issues with police brutality and issues with the sheer wealth inequality that you have in worldwide, really. But the view has very much become, we just need to get rid of all of it. It needs to all be broken down. And I feel like this has crept into even the Muslim communities as well, where there's often cynicism, and I would argue a lot of disrespect towards those that study the deen, that are imams, or they are speaking from a position of some authority, but that authority gets disrespected quite often these days. And it's in line with this kind of mentality, I feel.
Yeah, exactly. It's an interesting point you raise, Abeer, because I think it's almost like how that egalitarianism leads to disrespect for hierarchy and therefore tradition, because tradition has a hierarchy and has authority. Like there are people with authority in this religion due to their knowledge and their position, and we have to respect it. That's the leadership. That's guidance. So that's important to note. And people don't want guidance anymore. They don't want a hierarchy. They don't want people above them. Even though like you go to a modern office relative to like 50. If you go 50 years ago to an office, the CEO and management have their own offices. Today we're all sitting in the same room, but buddy, that guy's still earning like 5 times more than me, So it's, like, what does it even mean?
Yes, and of course, when you render all people equal, basically, or you have this principle that everybody is essentially equal. As you say, the qualitative differences then get swept away. I mean, like if I am sat with a scholar, person who is far more knowledgeable on the religion and all elements of the religion than I cannot in any way consider myself equal to them on those terms, even in terms of respect and so on. If I'm sat with an older a grandfather or something, I cannot communicate with them like as though we were equal. And in the same way, when we refer to our prophets, for example, and others who have like authority within our tradition, we cannot consider them to be equal to us or to those who came after them. What that does, as you say, Zan, not only does it undermine tradition, it also actually undermines the authority on which much of Islam built. If we just consider the prophet to be another human being, and what he says is the same as what any other person says, then what more do we have? We find this, to be honest, if we look at any of these so-called liberal Muslims, there is definitely this kind of stream of thought among them, like this desire to completely get rid of the authority of past scholars. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they disrespect the Prophet ﷺ, although we have seen that among some of them. But there is certainly this idea that where they don't have any intrinsic authority and or any kind of virtue which we do not have and which we cannot speak to. That all emerges from this kind of
that's right.
This egalitarianism that pervades liberal thinking.
That's right. Yeah, and it just I think on a very basic level, just undermines civilization. Like it's just how things are built. You put one rock on top of another, and one, like you build society, you build a civilization. So yeah, I don't mean to labor the point. I think we've explored quite a lot. You got one more, yeah?
Yeah, there is one thing I do want to say, because of course we do. In the past, many communities existed in non-centralized environments. Like even where you are part of an empire or something, particularly I'm talking about pre-modern empires, it was quite possible for communities to exist without any sort of interaction, or with very limited interaction with central authority. As an example, the Ottoman Empire, you had you had the Sultan and so on geographically located in Istanbul, and then you would have communities like far off, and these communities would be able to manage themselves and so on. And so someone might give that as an example of, oh look, these were egalitarian communities, and they just manage themselves on their own. But no, even when you go into these communities, there are like positions of authority within those. There are individuals who are, even families. Like not all families are equal. If you are from a family of landowners or individuals who are known to be scholarly and so on, and they have like a position of leadership. Like even communities, when they come together, they don't just create these egalitarian systems. No, they create their own hierarchies which help them manage themselves. So yeah.
No, that's right. And those hierarchies, like they are carriers of tradition. Like a great, even obviously, before World War I and II, when Europe destroyed all of its elites and their previously existing hierarchies, they basically just totally transformed their society. And it's interesting how that mirrors what happened during colonialism, which destroyed the indigenous hierarchies. I think we've read Things Fall Apart, and there's chieftains there, Igbo chieftains in southern Nigeria, in Igbo land, and they have their hierarchies, and they're the chieftains, and they have their way of managing their village and their community. And suddenly the British come, establish a court, and all existing hierarchies are gone. Respect for the elders doesn't matter. They're not in charge. Their knowledge, their management, obsolete. You're all now just the same. You're just all a bunch of random Igbo men here. Except obviously there's still a hierarchy. You've still got the colonist, and ironically, when we come over to back to Europe, and we're anti-hierarchy or whatever, you still have hierarchies. You still have the mega rich. You still have the political elites, and you still have the state. So there's an interesting mirroring there between the colonist, who has become, for the modern world, the state is the new colonist. Anyway, let's not get sucked into that rabbit hole. But yeah,
let's go to our next. Yeah.
Yeah, our next one now, I think, is individualism. Mm-hmm. And yes, would you like to start, Khabaib?
Yeah, no. So just to quickly define individualism, I guess off the top of my head, it's the idea that each individual is, subhanallah, is to be completely independent of the idea of breaking down communities, and so that individuals are absolutely free to do whatever they so wish, so long as of course they do not harm any other human being.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's correct. I think individualism is basically about social and moral autonomy, and I think it's important to mention Kant here, because in his book, his essay, What is Enlightenment? He specifically identifies the importance of individual freedom of the will. And again, for John Stuart Mill, he'll identify the importance of individual liberty. Like he says, real freedom is pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs. So individualism is very much tied in, first of all, with most, I think, liberal thinkers, and how their conception of liberty is very much an individual experience. And I think that can be very problematic in a lot of ways, how it can lead to very harmful social effects, how instead of having cohesive social collectives like we did in the past, takes a village to raise a child, and that sort of mentality. Now it's about it's about random atomized individuals in society who operate as economic agents, homo economicus. Their job is to produce output irrespective of where they came from or who their family is, because if you have these, first of all, this fetishizing of individual liberty basically means a break with traditional morality, tradition, and just source of tradition, because it means that the individual has the right to follow his own sort of social and moral rules, irrespective of what came before. Number one, and number two, important to note that how this ties in with the prevailing economic needs of society. The state is material and it needs output-oriented citizens who aren't going to be bogged down by, they live in some village somewhere. They need to, they need labor to be mobile and individual. But so a couple points there that I've sort of mentioned about how it's about social and moral autonomy and how that very much ties in with the economic needs of modern society and world.
Yeah,
and I think
sorry to put across. I was just going to say, you do see that, like, the way things are right now, it's extremely rare to have a single income household, especially for kind of the younger generations, like kind of 20, those that are 20 and up. Most people, when they get into a relationship, both the man and the woman are working, starting, even when you're starting a young family, you have to balance both of your careers with that as well, because economically that's what's required these days. And it's become rarer and rarer, of course, to stay within or stay close to family. As Zan says, you'll often have to move where the jobs are, you have to move where the work is, which is often where in the bigger cities you're living in a tiny box apartment, you're away from family. And yeah, because you end up, the focus becomes just on yourselves pretty much. That family structure is broken down, and yeah, we're seeing that more and more. It's very difficult to move beyond that, and you often see that struggle. I think, especially for people like ourselves who who come from kind of cultural backgrounds where family values and family connectivity is very, very important. You see that. We're a bit more, I think, aware of that struggle compared to maybe, I think it's fair to say, like, local kind of English people, British people, Irish people are a bit more accustomed to kind of being less connected with each other, or at least moving apart from each other, and maybe seeing each other just on kind of major holidays, that kind of a thing.
Oh, and what's especially interesting about this this element of liberalism in particular is the way it does. It not only does it divorce you from, of course, family, tribe, community, in your own time and space. It also actually divorces you from your history and your grandparents, if they happen to be deceased, great grandparents. The idea of being linked to something beyond yourself, not just a community like currently, but also being part of something more beyond yourself, because the focus of your life does become yourself. I haven't seen the movie, but I did see part of the trailer of the Barbie movie that recently came out, and one thing that really struck me, they had these like little Victorian girls playing with these baby dolls, and then this giant Barbie woman emerges, and all the babies and all the baby dolls are just thrown into the air and crushed and destroyed, because now something new has come along. It is the Barbie doll, and to me that is just it's a fascinating kind of reflection of the transition from the focus. This is like in the context of a woman, the focus from a kind of family-centered approach to actually the center now being the self. Like, how do you want to look? Or how do you want to dress yourself? It's no longer your responsibilities and obligations and duties and something, and looking out, like taking care of a life, or the life, more than just one life, actually, the lives of those around you. I think that's very much a symptom of this element of liberalism, which is individualism.
Absolutely, the idea that you owe nothing to anyone. There's no requirement to your parents. You don't have to take care of them, despite the fact that they took care of you and raised you. Even the idea that you don't owe anything to your children. If you want to just get an abortion, it's up to you. Only have the child when you feel you are ready for this responsibility, rather than facing your actual consequences.
John Stuart Mill even says in his essay on liberty, he says that liberty is about pursuing whatever tastes or pursuits you like. It's about, I'm reading it right here, of framing the plan of our life to suit our own character, of doing as we like, subject to the consequences that may follow. So he just qualify it. But It is incredible, and it's exactly like you were saying. It irrespective of what our fathers and grandfathers and families and our tradition says, we have to, we have the autonomy to pursue what we want, independent of sort of social and moral constraints. And obviously, the classic liberals like John Stuart Mill did put constraints on the idea of utilitarianism and liberty, but it hasn't manifested itself that way. I think it's safe to say, and it has just been overall this idea of individualism and individual autonomy and liberty has been one of it's been a divorce. It's been a decoupling, I think.
And I think it's already becoming clear, like how this element alone can very easily lead towards kind of a nihilistic view. But maybe we'll leave that for the end, for once we've discussed some of the others. Yeah.
And last thing I will say is that Robert Putnam is a famous sociologist and political theorist. He famously said that in this time in American history, and he said this in the 90s, more people are bowling alone than ever before. That's the name of his book. It's called Bowling Alone. And it's about how church attendance is down, Boy Scout attendance is down, Girl Scout, Parent-Teacher Association attendance. There's labor union attendance is down, Jimmy Hoffa's dead, like social groups are on the decline in America. And he directly relates it to individualism and how it's reducing social cohesion, harming educational outcomes, harming the family, increasing crime. It's just, so many social problems are very, according to famous philosophers and peer-reviewed papers, they're relating it to individualism. So it is just academically known as a harmful concept. And famously, again, Christopher Latch in the 20th century wrote his book, A Culture of Narcissism. How the modern American is a narcissist who has no respect for his past. And if you can't have no respect for your past without being individual and narcissistic. These are the arguments he made. So that's just the last thing I'll say about individualism. So,
excellent.
Yeah, some really interesting points there, and I suppose that probably brings us down towards. I guess we touched on it a little bit, like the concept of utilitarianism, and kind of how that plays a big part of liberalism as well. I don't know if there's anything you guys want to just expand on regarding that.
When it comes to, I guess the utilitarianism emerges from some of these elements, like individualism. I can see how individualism would give way to a utilitarian approach, because if you're dealing with each person as an individual, and they have like a set amount of interests, then
they have different utilities. People have different conceptions of utility, and so it's something that has to be anti-tradition and almost anti-morality. John Stuart Mill said that I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions. That's the dumbest thing I've heard. Let's abandon flipping, the 10 commandments of Moses, that our God-given scripture, tradition, and just do it to this vague concept of utility that doesn't really have any sort of universal applicability. That's like the famous critique of utility. What the hell is utility? What's the unit of utility? Utils? All right, great. Give me 5 utils. Anyway, so this is the conception of a very important conception of liberalism, brought forward by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And it is very problematic, and it is, again, like we've been saying, a decoupling from traditional moral authority.
And of course, I think what really does give them the confidence to start coming up with a lot of these new concepts, and certainly to move away from tradition and so on, is the idea that they were at the head of something great, that they were leading humanity towards some distant utopia. This concept of progress that we've spoken about before.
Let's go into that right now. Let's.
So yes. So yes, no. Of course, like if you look at any Enlightenment ideology, not just liberalism, there is within it this very subtle concept that humans are invariably, particularly the European human, is invariably like moving upward as time progresses. The idea that as time goes by, Europeans are invariably just going upwards, morally speaking, and in all other senses towards a promised utopia. You see this like in very clearly if you look at communist art from the Soviet period. I think I've mentioned this before, but if you look at communist art, very often the person in the picture will not be looking at you. They will be looking at something beyond you, and that is meant to be is meant to tell the viewer that, okay, you can't see what I see, but I am looking towards the future. I am looking towards that utopia. Just follow me, and I will lead you there. So and this is present in all kind of Enlightenment thinking, whether it is feminist thought, whether it is liberal thought, capitalist thought, whatever. Like feminists imagine this like distant utopia where like where women will be free from the patriarchy and the patriarchy will be destroyed, and then like modern kind of sexuality driven people are driven by this like ultimate utopia where like we will finally get rid of the straight human, and everyone will be able to exist wherever they want on the spectrum. Yes, subhanallah.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, Khabaib, because I always thought that those communist paintings were making eye contact with me because Russians aren't trustworthy. But I like what you said more than that. I just assumed that the Soviets were a bit shifty. But no, apologies. Yeah, that's 100% correct, and I think it's important to notice to note that this idea of progress and meliorism that is inherent to liberalism and the Enlightenment and communism, feminism, it's not just a reflection of what they view as their political and civilizational trajectory, and not just even their conception of history. Hegel and Marx thought, oh, we're here, we're going there. Marx said we're democratic and capitalist, and we're going to end up socialist. Hegel as well had an evolutionary conception of history. It's something you notice throughout their philosophy and history. At least in the Enlightenment period. It's about movement, one place to another, progress. It's a process. Even economics, it's about liberalization, privatization, deregulation. It's even secularism. You don't have secularism, you have secularization. It's a constant struggle. They've been talking about secularism in France for like 300 years straight, just constantly secularizing. And even civilization, it's not an objective. It's a process. We have the civilizing process, and it's just when does it end? And again, so all of these things about how their civilization, their politics, their history, their economics it's all about movement. It comes down to the fact that existentially, the European is in a state of becoming. According to Muhammad Sayyid al-Atas in his book Islam and Secularism, that fundamentally that the state of European philosophy and his existence, the European, is one of becoming something else. I am one thing and I'm becoming something else. And again, this relates back to what we were saying about individualism and egalitarianism. It's about becoming something else because we're moving beyond tradition and history and the moral resources of the past into something bright and new and better in the future. And this is very problematic because you can't build the foundations of a society on civilization, on shifting sands, and definitely not on philosophically shifting sands. And it's directly at odds with, I think, most pre-modern societies, and definitely with Islam. Sayyid Muhammad al-Atas says that whereas the Europeans are becoming, the Muslim is being. Our moral resources were given to us in the 7th century. And they've never changed. Our tradition has grown and expanded and adapted, but the fundamentals of this religion have been the same since the 7th century, and more people are realizing it. They look around societies, then they look around the world. Everything is changing because obviously modernity is a product of the Enlightenment and therefore has inherited that existential sense of movement. And people around the world are noticing it. And there's one group of people who are rock solid, not changing, sticking to their tradition, and that's the Muslims. And so it's important to recognize that one, this is a fundamental concept, part of liberalism and and the Enlightenment. How problematic it is for society, for morality, for any sort of healthy conception of a civilization, and for that, what it fundamentally means is that when they say progress and their idea of moving towards something, it is fundamentally European. They think, oh, the world is going to move towards something, and that something is the European conception of modernity, of philosophy, of civilization, and that's why, they had the civilizing mission. We're going to cause progress in the global south with our, colonialism. We're going to push them towards, being modern. And being modern just means being European. So you see how it's, one, problematic on a lot of different ways, socially and morally, just for Europe. Then, of course, also how that's had ramifications for the rest of the world. We have to invade Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're going to help them enter the modern world. We're going to colonize these places to help them enter the modern world. It's just, it's very dangerous ideological baggage, this concept of progress. And yeah, there you go. There it is.
Yeah, and morally speaking, of course, for us as Muslims, of course, it's an unthinkable concept, because of course our morals are quite fixed, and there's no idea that tomorrow we will know more about objective morality than the Prophet ﷺ or his companions knew. But what the concept of progress as it exists in the Enlightenment tradition, and particularly in liberalism, does mean is that, day on day, year on year, decade on decade, your morality, they think, of course, from their viewpoint, they're uncovering and discovering some kind of like higher truths or whatever it is, because of course invariably as time progresses, like they become more aware, and the truths they did not realize before become apparent. But what it means in terms of the human being is what you thought was correct 10 years ago. What you felt was fixed and unchangeable 10 years ago. Today, you'll find it has shifted completely, and you've been left behind. And of course, this refers to the shifting sands comment you made, Zan. But it exists very much, and this is another element of why we find in these societies that there is this immense difference between generations. It becomes a real social issue when grandparents have one worldview and their grandchildren have something entirely different. How can you speak across generations? How can society function? Not that, of course, the liberal project wants society to exist at all, but how can a society really exist when year on year people are taking on completely different concepts and worldviews?
Oh, I think that's a really important to note. It's a really good way to identify. A really important thing to identify. Not only between generations, but inside generations. We've got atomized individuals focusing on their own individual liberty and tastes and pursuits. If we're constantly progressing and changing, how is one generation going to understand the other? But even just across generations, and this is why Zygmunt Bauman says that if you go to modern America, that you basically just live in a society of strangers. You live in your own kind of group and bubble, your own ethnic group, or you and your abortion mates over here, I don't know what, and everyone else is just a stranger with his own race and his own philosophy and his own flippant political values. It's just a society of strangers. It's very problematic, and there you go. There it is.
Well, yeah. Of course, in more traditional societies, you do not see this. At least it's not as marked. Of course, like technological change does mean that ultimately, like maybe younger generations will have a better understanding. But at least in my experience of of traditional communities, grandchildren tend to be very much on the same wavelength as their grandparents, and that's because they live with them. They live with them constantly. They're always kind of in touch with them on a daily basis. These grandchildren are going to be with their grandparents. They're going to help them. They might live with them for weeks on end. Whereas in many Western societies, you might not see your grandparents more than maybe once a year, twice a year, perhaps. How can we expect these grandchildren to understand their grandparents and that generation and the way they see the world if they don't actually interact with them at all? And you're the only thing that really contributes to your understanding is the school system and whatever the state has told it to teach you, and of course popular culture and so on. It's not going to create any sense of continuity. It's going to leave most young people in a constant state of being divorced from the past or overcoming the past or looking towards the past as superstition and backwardness and so on, something that we must overcome rather than turn to for any kind of wisdom or guidance.
No, fantastic. I think that's exactly accurate. And again, it relates back to what Christopher Latch said about how that sort of thinking just creates a culture of narcissism. But yeah, no, I think we've covered progress now. And I think the last point here is universalism. I think we can touch on this quickly and then move on to the Enlightenment and nihilism. But yeah, I think this is we've already sort of touched upon how liberalism and the Enlightenment are universalist, but we should just explicitly say that the Enlightenment and liberalism and communism as constituents of it was a universalist project trying to create a universal utopian civilization based on common values and culture. And while that sounds really nice and pretty, what it basically meant was creating a universal European civilization that Africans and Asians and Arabs and Indians, that we're all just going to abandon, our beliefs, our moral backgrounds, our cultures, our tradition, and just progress into this universal civilization, of their making. And that just, obviously, it's so problematic in so many ways, how it relates to how it's almost a justification for colonialism. It's a justification for modern interventionism by Europe and America, how it devalues the moral character, moral worth of non-European societies, devalues their culture and their tradition. And I think you do see that in a lot of places. You meet people from Nigeria and Peru or wherever else, Pakistan, and they're like, I'm progressive, and that's just code for saying, I want to adopt European culture and philosophy, and what we currently have is backwards and wrong. And it's just one problematic narrative that is strongly related to this idea, to these ideas, of liberalism and the Enlightenment, of progress and universalism. It's just a massive devaluation of everything else.
And of course, what universalism, as you mentioned, Zan, does create is this culture of interventionism. And I don't think the imperial project would have been possible without this kind of confidence that actually the values we hold and we as Europeans, we are here to bring civilization and to bring we carry the white man's burden, and we are going out there to educate these uncultured and uncivilized masses. We're bringing them the light of reason and the light of the Enlightenment and so on. What it essentially does is it creates this very kind of paternalistic superiority complex towards all non-Europeans, essentially. And it doesn't matter how far along the route of adopting European values any non-Europeans ever get. Truth is, it is Europe or America or the West that carries this great beacon, and they will forever be kind of leading the way, and you must always be following. And of course, in terms of actual real world, away from this all of these big words and so on, what these universalist values have given us are interventions in the past in the forms of imperialism, and of course interventionism in the present, whereas whether it is in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, wherever we see interventionism, whether in the form of soldiers on the ground or in the form of like very aggressive media campaigns against certain countries and so on, for whatever reason, it's this particular value that's at play. Yeah.
No, that's it exactly. That's it exactly. I think it's quite an obvious point as soon as you pointed out that this is their worldview. So I don't think we need to labor it. I think that now would probably be a good time, I think, just to talk a little bit about the Enlightenment. I don't think we have to spend long on it because we've already sort of been mentioning it throughout. But let's just say unequivocally that liberalism, as we've said multiple times, is a product of the Enlightenment, and the fundamental features of the Enlightenment are progress, universalism, being anti-tradition, and being rationalist, which we haven't touched on so much. And the Enlightenment was trying to create a universal civilization. If it wasn't the liberals trying to create it, then it was the communists. And what the end of the Cold War was, what the end, the one universalist ideology failing to another. The Soviets wanted to create a communist world. That's they were also universalists. So I think that's self-explanatory. And again, progress. That the communists, we're here, we're going to get there. We've got the Tsar, and we've got the Orthodox Church, and we've got all these traditions and social structures. We need to get rid of all of that, reform the land, kill the aristocracy, stop capitalism, and become communist. The entire conception was progressive. Even when they showed up and colonized Central Asia, it was like, oh, Islam is backwards. The Sufism was very big in Central Asia. Oh, your Sufi saints and your shrines, that's all just mysticism and ghosts. Get rid of it and become modern. Again, they totally sanitized the idea of Islam according to their doctrine of progress. So again, that's just really obvious and accessible, I think, to see how the Enlightenment is universalist and progressive. And we've been talking throughout about how individualism and egalitarianism in terms of liberalism are how they result in anti-tradition. But this is just an aspect of the Enlightenment. It is anti-tradition. Abandon what you have, your culture and your history and your moral values and resources, and just adopt, whatever Europe is doing. Not what they currently have, because what they're doing changes every 5 minutes. So again, those are three things I think we've covered throughout. Throughout our discussion of liberalism, we've identified that idea of universalism and progress and anti-tradition being paradigmatic in both liberalism and communism and the Enlightenment. Is there anything you want to add before I think we should just break down rationalism?
No, I think it's quite clear, and I think it would just be a matter of giving more examples. You mentioned the Soviets. Of course, in the Spanish Civil War we saw the same kind of dynamic where certainly the kind of the leftists were all very like anti-religion, anti the desecrated churches and so on, and that was all part of this kind of element of we need to get rid of this old traditional backward Spain, and we need to move invariably forward towards this kind of workers' revolution and the utopia and the classless society promised by that. Yeah, just a matter of more examples, but I think it's all very clear in that sense.
I think just to quickly add to this, I think it's good that you mentioned as well that this concept of the Enlightenment and universalism and everything, it wasn't unique just to kind of what we understand as Western liberalism. The fact that it did apply to communism and other ideologies that we've seen in the past as well. Because I suppose, especially today, the assumption is that, I think from a lot of people, is that this is just an idea of liberalism and nothing else. And you've seen like a lot of Muslims and especially younger people, kind of Gen Z and a lot of younger millennials tend to gravitate towards socialism and communism. These because of their, I suppose, dislike of capitalism more than anything else. So I think it's a good lesson for a lot of people, and it's something that I would certainly recommend delving more, like just for people to delve more into in the actual history of communism as well as socialism, because it certainly has been incredibly antagonistic towards Muslims as well, and that's certainly worth highlighting and remembering.
No, 100%. Yeah, and people need to distinguish that, how liberalism and communism, like I said, they're both part of the Enlightenment project. They're both material ideologies which don't acknowledge the existence of the metaphysical and the moral, and focus on a material worldview, which is why they're both very output-oriented ideologies focused on the economic, because economics is material, and how fundamentally both ideologies are European. You know, like countries like China and Vietnam, they've just adopted the Eurocentric worldview. So it's not, especially for Muslims, it's not an alternative to liberalism. It's just being European with extra steps. But yeah. And
when it comes to rationalism, I think that actually moves us quite nicely, because the idea of only seeing the world as material and as resources and so on, that is an element of rationalist thought.
No, that's it exactly. Rationalism totally underpinned the Enlightenment. The idea that using reason to navigate the world and to come up with moral outcomes is appropriate and acceptable. And this later resulted in this was in the Enlightenment a very scientific rationalism, that we can use scientific methods to navigate the world and whatever else. And it's important to note that an important figure in this was Thomas Hobbes, who John Gray calls a proto-Enlightenment thinker, because a lot of the things he did and his methodologies became very big in the Enlightenment. Specifically, his use of rationalism, which he used to try to understand the state of nature and the political environment. That methodology became paradigmatic in the Enlightenment. The use of human reason to come to understand, to come to moral and political outcomes. And again, that just undermines tradition, undermines morality. Doesn't matter what happened in the past, because we're using our brand new scientific method that doesn't take into account truth and metaphysics. So it's in both liberalism and communism, and it's very, very problematic.
And rationalism in particular is one of those. It's one of the elements of Enlightenment thinking that I think has pervaded. It has had like global impact. I mean, like even within our Islamic tradition, I think we see it. This desire to look at the tradition in rationalist. In a rationalist sense, actually gave rise in the 19th century to a lot of like neo-Mu'tazilite thinking and so on, which we still see to this day, and even maybe in some very literalist schools of thought to the present, which insist on removing any kind of mystical elements, and really just want to streamline Islam, simplify it, and just make it as rational as possible. In that sense, these are all effects of this kind of Enlightenment rationalism.
It's true. Not only rationalism, but again, universalism. You might there are some strands of Islam today, and I'm not criticizing them, but some people want to create a universalist Islam, irrespective of our cultural and legal pluralism and diversity, and the idea that for example, how certain Sufi practices and ideas, which I don't do myself, but I respect, how they're backwards and magical. It does feel like it's coming from a place of rationalism. And someone who talks about this a bit actually is a guy called Adib Khalid. He wrote a book called Islam and Communism, talking about how communist rationalism affected modern interpretations of Islam in Central Asia. Fascinating stuff.
Interesting.
But yeah. I think that's all good, self-explanatory. I think we can move on from the Enlightenment and use our last sort of 10-15 minutes to relate everything we've said to nihilism. Unless there's anything you want to add yourselves, fellas, to anything.
No, I think that all sounds good. I think we've touched on a lot. I mean, this is such a broad topic; it's difficult to cover everything. fully and comprehensively in one podcast episode, but I think we've done a good job of kind of going through the different elements of liberalism, kind of what they mean, what impact or effect they've had, especially on Muslims and on the Muslim world as well. And I think so. I don't think there's too much else to really add, and we can jump into nihilism now. Really,
let's do it. Yep.
Perfect. Yeah. So I think from my perspective, that the thing I want to mention is going to be that. Well, first of all, how would we define nihilism, Khabaib? I was saying earlier that it's basically a lack of belief in morality and truth and the idea that existence has no meaning. Is that correct from your perspective? Yep.
Yeah. I think that's essentially what it is. Yes. And I think just before this podcast started, we distinguished it. At least technically, it's distinguished from existentialism in the sense that existentialism is the idea that you create your own meaning. It accepts the nihilist premise that the world has no meaning, and then goes the extra step of saying, actually, in that case, we as human beings need to create our own meaning. But for us, I think it's too much the same thing when it comes down to it. It's the denial of any kind of meaning.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I think it's the person who I want to talk about at this point is Friedrich Nietzsche, who, if people don't know, was a 19th century German philosopher who was very prominent in discussions of existentialism and nihilism and modern Europe. He acted as a diagnostician of modernity. And I think why he's specifically important to mention is because I think his form of nihilism is what we find in the world today as being paradigmatic. John Gray and Alistair McIntyre, in their books, they both recognize this as important. And John Gray even goes so far as to say that Friedrich Nietzsche is the moral philosopher of modernity. And the reason he does so is because while it was the Enlightenment that tried to decouple morality from its traditional sources, people in the Enlightenment were trying to create a new universal morality based on rationalism. And that's what Kant specifically was famous for, trying to create a new universal morality. But what Nietzsche did was he took that project as exemplified in the work of Kant, the most important Enlightenment thinker, and he turned morality into something that each individual creates. He disagreed with the idea of that you could create a universal morality in the post-Christian period, and said that each individual has to make his own meaning. God is dead, and the Superman has come, and the Superman is going to overcome. Man is going to overcome himself and become the Superman. Creating his own morality, his own values, discarding tradition and scripture, because God is dead. And that is pretty much how the modern individual acts. He acts as a Nietzschean nihilist. He creates his own values and his own beliefs, irrespective of tradition and culture and morality. And you can see here, that this modern person following the method that Nietzsche advocated is synonymous with the modern liberal. That the modern liberal is decoupled from tradition and family and previous sources of morality and scripture and so on, and he rationally determines whatever outcomes he or she wants. That is synonymous with what Nietzsche advocated. And so we see that the various aspects of liberalism that we have discussed strongly conform with the Nietzschean conception of how persons should act, and how that conception is nihilistic.
That's it. Other elements that Nietzsche goes into, of course, I mean, like Nietzsche is very famous for his saying that God is dead, and as you said, Zayn, he was a diagnostician. Sorry, so he was looking at the society around him, and he was like, look, we are in a post-Christian. Like the people around us no longer act in a way that actually says they believe in God, and therefore, as far as these people are concerned, God is dead for them. And now that you do not have a foundation for any kind of morality without God, what must you do? And he told them, well, you guys need to go out there and you need to create your own morality in order to be able to survive out there. And I think we both read the Thus Spoke Zarathustra and some other works by Nietzsche. You see constantly in his works this idea that man is something that must be overcome.
Sorry, Khabaib, you just cut out.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So you were just saying that you were talking about how Nietzsche constantly talks about man overcoming.
Yes. So Nietzsche always talks about this idea of man being something that must be overcome, and breaking the table of values. That we must work towards creating the Superman, or we await the Superman. And these are all kind of elements of Enlightenment thinking.
That's right.
Like destroying the table of values. All morality.
Anti-tradition. Yeah.
Exactly, it's anti-tradition. Overcoming man, also anti-traditional. Because man is everything that has come before, right? And everything that man has produced before. And then of course his critique of religious institutions, priests, and Socrates as his critique of Socrates as the moral philosopher, and so on. All of these fit very, very clearly within kind of even the idea of creating a Superman. It's a very individualist process, because Zarathustra is just up there in his cave and he's just on his own and he's just doing his thing, and he's in this process of becoming. So it's actually it does encourage this idea of, well, you need to in order to achieve your highest self, you must kind of withdraw from the community. You must withdraw from any kind of. In fact, when it comes to Zarathustra, we know nothing about, like, he's fatherless, brotherless, sisterless, son.
That's
he
right.
has no. He's just this kind of.
He's decoupled, divorced.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And wherever he goes, he's rejected because he's not tied to anybody in terms of tribally or familially or socially and so on.
No, 100%. Like what Nietzsche advocates is creating this individualized Superman, divorced from tradition, who's totally free to follow his own reason, who's totally unencumbered, and so you can see here that the different aspects of liberal philosophy have created this Superman, the individualism to be a Superman, to the egalitarianism, the meliorism, because God is dead and you have to progress towards the Superman. It's something to reach. The Superman is something to reach toward. It's an object of the future, and it famously Nietzsche says in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he says, "Don't speak to me of my fatherland, speak to me of my children's land." It's this conception, like father and hierarchy, tradition, the past. Forget about that, because it's my children's land. That's where the Superman will live. He speaks so metaphorically, but across this book. But to me, that was a great example of discarding tradition and family and choosing the future. Your children's land. So very, very powerful. It's almost, I find that book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a really important way to understand Nietzsche's philosophy and nihilism, but it's just a diagnosis of the modern world. It's like the Bible of modernity and rationalism. It's quite intriguing, and I think if you read it, you will find different aspects of liberalism and Enlightenment philosophy informing that work, except for the idea of universalism, and that's because he is obviously against that concept. He wants every individual to create his own morality. So there's a certain element of Nietzsche that is sort of counter-Enlightenment. And I think it's important to note as well that, liberalism and the Enlightenment, the idea that you're progressing and moving, it destabilizes morality and social cohesion and whatever else. To such an extent that John Gray says that Enlightenment philosophies are self-defeating. And so that I find it quite interesting that to a certain extent, Nietzsche undermined Kant in the Enlightenment by attacking universalism. Again, I think if you look at societies today with these Nietzschean nihilists, disguised as liberals, inhabiting America and Europe, that they are the reason why Europe and America has bad prospects for the future, because they don't value family, because they don't shake hands with their neighbor. They're atomized individuals focused on output, who can't create a socially cohesive society. So it's important to note how it's sort of all related. This liberal Enlightenment nihilist sort of world we're inhabiting. And how, again, I love to say it, Nietzsche is the moral philosopher of modernity, because it's his work who people are following.
Yeah, even if they don't realize it, because it's reached such a level that it has become really quite normative, and. In the office, or like in a shop, and without realizing this, they are actually like coming out with Nietzschean thoughts. When they say, I'm just doing something because this is what makes me happy, or I do X, Y, or Z because this I'm living my best life in this way. YOLO. All of these are subtle Nietzschean influences, because you are going out there, you're hit by this kind of realization. Oh my God! There's nothing like God is dead in the Nietzschean way. Essentially morality. I don't have any kind of moral framework. I have nothing to lean upon. I have no tradition that can stabilize me out there. And so they need to go out there, and they need to busy themselves with immediate things that they immediately make meaningful to them. This might seem kind of like a bit of a banalization, but when it comes to the process of creating meaning, people can create meanings out of the most really mundane things. Football culture, for instance, for many people, that is life. That is life. I was once speaking to somebody who told me they had met someone once who was a PhD in the science of spoons, and this guy had just spent hours speaking to him purely about spoons. He was a big spoon collector. He'd made that the meaning of his life. This is what Nietzschean philosophy does. You go out there, you create your own meaning, and then that becomes your morality and your source of happiness and whatnot. And it just
10 years studying spoons. God damn.
And that was literally the core message at the end of the film, Everything Everywhere All at Once, was that little things that you find joy in, that is essentially the meaning of life. And it was all, whether it be the struggle to maintain your laundry business with your wife, or even if it was just some weird fetish you have, that's what essentially life comes down to. Because after this, there's nothing else. So just enjoy what you have. That concept, and you see, so it's very, very deeply ingrained in our culture, in pop, certainly in pop culture, and you see it in the day to day, and it's not uncommon to see that belief that it's very common that people will just say, oh, just focus on being a good person, but what a good person is changing every couple of weeks. It seems as well. That's the other dilemma.
No, exactly that. And I think at some stage we're definitely going to have to spend a podcast just examining how cultural output and cinema reflects the pervasiveness of this nihilism. But
100%.
I think that's actually
but this was good. I think this was a good session. I think a lot of interesting points and subject matter. Definitely some good reading material was mentioned for a lot of people as well. So no, thank you very much to both of you for your time, and hopefully everyone watching and listening to this, you found it interesting, you found it beneficial, and inshallah we'll see you on the next podcast episode as well. From all of us, take care.